gentle linnet bird, nightingale, blackbird, teach me how to sing. Found it. Okay, so this is Victor Garber. Here you can see him with his beautiful, beautiful 1970s sideburns that were so wildly distracting during the entirety of the first production. Like true. Where's the screen? There's the screen. Look at that. Look at that. They're spectacular. They're spectacular. Anyway, hi. Welcome. Welcome to my latest special interest. I'm so glad to have you for this beast of a video. Okay, side tangent. This whole video is gonna be side tangents. I have been like beating myself up over the last 3 weeks working on this 4 weeks working on this project, being like, wow, you know, I'm not as productive as I used to be. My Wicked video, because I've been doing this series, like my Wicked video in the series was so much faster to write and to research, and so like, what am I doing? I need to like get my brain in the game. I'm out of it, whatever. I discovered when dividing this up into 2 parts to film, because I just can't do this whole thing in one go, it's so long, that the word count for part 1 of this video is the length of the Wicked video in its entirety. So I feel less bad about myself now, now that I know that. I don't know what the total word count of the video is going to be. I will update you when I haven't written the second part yet. I'm mostly done with the second. I'm like 3/4 of the way done with the second part. But I wanted to film this over 2 days and have time to edit it before it comes out on Wednesday. Hi, Future Sydney here. The video ended up being just over 27,000 words in its entirety, so I filmed about 16,000 words this morning. This is part 1. I'm going to film the other 11,000 tomorrow, and I'm gonna put them into just 2 separate parts for the sake of getting YouTube auto captions to get the auto captions in time so that I can edit them so that these can actually go up on time. So part 2 will be linked at the end of this video, so you can go over check that one out. That bit is going to be the individual characters and adaptations, while this bit is going to be more the history and the background, but they very much feed into each other, so please don't just skip to part 2 because it's not going to make any sense. Yeah, thanks for sticking around for this ride of the video, and let's get back into it. We're gonna attend the tale today, as it were, and trace themes of madness throughout Sondheim's Sweeney Todd the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, from the original story through all 4 Broadway productions. We're gonna talk about where this story came from. We're gonna talk about the history of when it took place and the history of when it was written. We're gonna look at 5 different characters in depth. It's gonna be a really great time. If you're not familiar with the story, it does involve murder, baking people into meat pies, madness and institutionalization, attempted slide, assaults, and child assault energy. It doesn't explicitly happen, but the energy is totally there, and not treating animals nicely for a short bit. So if you don't want to hear about any of those things right now, you're super welcome to click off of this video. I do have a disability media deep dive that I just mentioned about Wicked, which you can watch up here, that is more content friendly. This show was kind of hilarious though, so the video is going to stay as light as possible, but obviously there are a lot of dark themes to analyze. Also, we will probably at some point end up discussing the logistics of what Sweeney and Lovett's baking process might have looked like for the sake of filling in plot holes, but I will give you time codes for that if you want to skip it. So with that, let me introduce myself, and then let's get into this marathon of a video. If you're new here, hi, my name is Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a white person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I currently have a green bow in it, and I'm wearing a grayish green vintagey dress because this is a light Joanna cosplay situation, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. I'm a multi-hyphenate actor, dramaturg, composer, disability rights educator, and Broadway access reviewer. I make videos on all kinds of topics within the disability, accessibility, education, media, media analysis realms. So this video is part of my series where I break down often hidden or forgotten about disability within our theater canon. This is technically the 6th in the series if you want to count my Kimberly Akimbo and Curious Incident videos. I've also done Ride the Cyclone, Wicked, and How to Dance in Ohio. Also, Ohio is closing next weekend, so you should go see it before it does that because it's incredible. I might put all of those videos in a playlist for you. That seems like a good idea. I'm gonna do that, and I'll link it at the top of the description if you want to watch other videos like this. I anticipate running out of cards to link things in this video because we are going to be covering a lot of content. I also want to give a quick thank you shout out to the handful of scholars who talked me through a lot of my ideas for this project via text, like all day, every day for like a solid week. I'm not going to name you because I forgot to ask all of you if that was okay, but you know who you are. Thanks. Also to my roommate for listening to me ramble about Sweeney Todd for several weeks straight, and to the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts Theater on Film and Tape archive for existing, because it meant that I got to watch the past 3 Broadway productions of the show for free because they have them filmed and archived most Broadway shows, not all, but a lot of Broadway shows are filmed and archived there throughout history, which is really, really cool. So support your local libraries because they're great. If you want to learn how to get a library card and or make use of that archive, I did make an access review for it, which you can find on my Instagram, but it's also on my website. I will link that below for you. And I will also link the access review for the 2023 Broadway production of Sweeney Todd as well if you need that. So the plan, we're going to do a summary of the show. Spoilers! Obviously. Then we're going to talk about the history of the show, the history of the story, the history of the setting of the story and how that informs the story, the history of when this musical was written and how that informs the story. We're going to then talk in depth about 5 different characters, trace their portrayals throughout 7 different versions of the story, including my review of each version that I saw because I'm me. You know that I'm going to do that. And then we're going to finish up by talking about what all of this means. So grab a meat pie and some maybe don't do that. You never know what's in a meat pie. Don't do that. Grab a snack, grab a blanket, whatever. Let's talk about Sweeney Todd. Also, just to preface this, I'm sorry, there's so many like caveats to this video. I would like it known that I did not know anything about this show a month ago when I went to see it other than Dead People, Pies, Sondheim, Josh Groban, and Annalee Ashford, and that was it. And this show was a ride for people who know what's happening, and I did not know what was happening. And I also don't know any Sondheim outside of like I did Into the Woods Jr. when I was 14. I was Cinderella, if you're wondering. But yeah, this show is just so much, and the audience energy was fantastic, and I was never bored. I loved it. Sometimes I do deep dives into things, and like halfway through the deep dive, it gets repetitive, and I want to bash my head against a wall. But after a gazillion different versions of studying this non-stop for weeks and weeks, I still found new treasures every single time. And I still listen to the soundtrack like every day, and I don't know how they did it. And I also don't know how I managed to be a theater kid and not know a single thing about Sweeney Todd before this. What? Also, to give a timeline, I saw the show at the end of December. I started research for this the second week of January. It was shortly after I got sick. Over the course of a week, I consumed most adaptations I could get my hands on. I combed through the script several times, and then halfway through writing this video, I won the ticket lottery to go see it a second time, and I was super excited and raptured, and I laughed at all of the jokes still, despite knowing everything and knowing what to expect, and I had an amazing time, which says so much about the source material as well as the specific direction of this revival. I also, while I was there, befriended several people sitting behind me at intermission, and we had a whole academic discussion about the history of the piece, which was fun. I'm never gonna see those people again, but they wish me good luck on writing my paper, so thanks, random people. But yeah, anyway, this video got delayed because I ended up taking 5 pages of notes at that show, and I had to rewrite a bunch, and yeah, summary, we are focusing. This video is already long enough. So, this show opens with a prelude. Is it called a prelude or a prologue? It's called a prologue, not a prelude, so I've already messed up. But yeah, so the prologue basically tells you the story of like, hey, here's what our story's about. It's the song that everybody knows from Sweeney. If you are familiar with any Sweeney Todd songs, it's the like, attend the tale of Sweeney Todd, that song. If you're familiar with Hamilton and not Sweeney Todd, Lin based the concept of his opening number of Hamilton on this song. So if that helps conceptualize it a little bit. This is also the number that they performed at the Tony Awards last year. Do yourself a favor, look up their performance of this, because the staging in this revival makes it one of the coolest opening numbers I think I've ever seen, and I cry every single time. And I cry when I hear the song because I'm imagining the staging of it. It's spectacular. We're gonna get to why it's spectacular later, but just like take a second, open a new tab, watch that video, then come back. No, I'm serious. Please go do that. The show's mostly sung through, but not entirely. I forgot to mention that. Okay, so the prologue is done. Now it's Act 1. It's 1846. Sweeney Todd and a teenager named Antony appear. They've just gotten off a ship that is docked in London after Antony rescued him at sea, and they've become friends, though Sweeney doesn't really talk and didn't tell him much about who he is or what happened, so I'm not really sure how friendly they actually got, but also Antony befriends people and loves them upon first glance. We're gonna see him do that later with Joanna, so this feels kind of on brand for him. If I remember correctly, Sweeney never calls him friend in return, but I'm not 100% positive on that, and I'm not gonna comb the entire script to find it out. That's beside the point. They're in London. Sweeney tells Antony about how there was a barber and his wife, and there was a judge who thought the woman was very beautiful, and so he decides to send the barber off to Australia, where Sweeney has been for 15 years, on a trumped up charge so that he could have access to the wife. That wife is named Lucy, by the way. During this exchange, we meet the beggar woman, who is a houseless woman who comes by begging them for alms. Antony gives her a coin, and then she sexually solicits them, and Sweeney yells at her to get away. And Antony, I must note, is the only character in the show to ever give her anything, which is it just feels important to me, and I haven't figured out why that feels important to me, but it does. Anyway, after all of this, Sweeney goes to Fleet Street to try to figure out what happened to his wife, going into Mrs. Lovett's pie shop. And Mrs. Lovett gets really excited there's a customer because she has not had one in weeks because she makes self-described the worst pies in London. The song is hilarious. She tells Sweeney about how there was a barber and his wife and their 1-year-old baby, Joanna, and after the barber was sent away, the judge and his beetles are like judge sidekicks, tricked Lucy into going into his house during a party where everybody wore masks and she got super disoriented, and then they took her in and they assaulted her. Unclear what the timeline of this was, unclear how many times this happened, if it was just a one-off case, but that's the story that we get. At this point in the story, Sweeney gets angry and he yells, "Would no one have mercy on her?" And Lovett is like, "Ha! So it is you! You're Benjamin Barker!" And he's like, "I'm not Barker. I'm Sweeney now. Sweeney Todd." And then he asks what happens to his wife, and she says that Lucy poisoned herself with arsenic, and Judge Turpin took in Joanna as his ward, and Sweeney vows to have revenge on the judge and the beetle, and Lovett gives him his silver razors because she had saved them after he'd been transported to Australia for some reason, and he sings a love song to them about how they're going to help him get his long-awaited revenge. Then we transition to Judge Turpin's house where we see 16-year-old Joanna standing by her window. She sings a song called Greenfinch and Linnet Bird, which is what I was singing at the beginning of this video, and she sings to the birds asking how they manage to keep singing while in their cages, and it's because she is like imprisoned within her own house because the judge won't let her out, and it's just so sad and beautiful, and I adore it. While she sings this, Anthony walks by, notices her in the window, and hopes that she will notice him because she's just so beautiful, and then she does, and they make eye contact, and she waves at him really awkwardly because she doesn't know how to human, and then he buys her a bird from the bird seller to give to her, and she comes out to get it, and he sings to her about how he's gonna steal her away from her cage, and she's not quite sure what to do with him because she doesn't know how people work, but she's really excited about the bird, and clearly she finds him attractive. That's like pretty obvious. Now Judge Turpin and the beetle reappear and they reprimand her for leaving her room and for giving attention to some heedless young boy. The judge compliments her dress in a creepy way. We'll get back to that. And then the beetle kills the bird, saying, "Anthony, if I see you again, it'll be your neck next time." Transition to the marketplace, where everybody is gathered around the caravan of flamboyant Italian barber Pirelli, who claims to have shaved the Pope and the King of Naples. He's a guy. His assistant, Tobias, described in the script as adolescent and simple-minded, comes out to tell everybody about how Pirelli's magical miracle elixir cured his balding head and helped him grow long, luscious hair, which, for the record, he has a line in the song where he sings about how anything that uses the miracle elixir soon sprouts curls. And not a single production has used a curly wig for Tobias in this scene. He always has straight hair, and it really bothers me. That's all. Sweeney loudly says that this elixir is piss and that Pirelli is a fraud, and he challenges him to a contest, and whoever can give the best and fastest shave and also tooth pull gets £5. The tooth pulling is in the original production and in the Tim Burton film. It is not in the 1989 production, the 2005 production, or the 2023 production, which makes sense. We don't associate barbers as also being surgeons and tooth pullers anymore, though that is what they used to do. They used to do all of that. We're gonna talk about that in the history section later. But also, the tooth pulling scene is horrifying because Pirelli holds down Tobias and tries to rip out one of his teeth, and it's awful. Pirelli shows off a lot and he tries to be all fancy, but ultimately Todd wins because he's better at what he does and he proves himself as a great barber, and so then people will start coming to his shop above Mrs. Lovett's pie shop. After this, we have a song that was cut from the original production during previews and is not in the 2023 version. However, it is in the 1989 revival and the 2005 revival. I don't think it is in the film, but I'm not 100% sure about it. Some of the lines from it and energy from it are present, however, if I remember correctly. The song is called Joanna Mea Culpa, and basically the judge watches Joanna through the peephole of her room and flagellates himself over his lust for her. It's creepy, super well written. For the record, it's beautifully well written. I just hate it because of what it is. It's great in showing you that the judge is kind of the actual worst, but there's also enough lines implying that he is creepy towards her, and I think much like how the tooth pulling makes it explicit how abusive Pirelli is to Tobias, it leans over from character exposition into this is just hard to watch and we already know this information, so I'm not opposed with it being cut. Also, without it, Act 1 is already like 90 minutes long, so those two things make a lot of sense to cut in order to shorten Act 1 a little bit. Now after that scene, we go back to the barber shop where Sweeney is stressed that the beetle has yet to show up for a shave because he's anxious to get his revenge done and over with, and Lovett sings to him about how he needs to relax and learn to wait and enjoy half the fun is to plan the plan. Then Anthony runs in and says he plans to elope with Joanna, who had dropped a key from her window when he walked by that day, so when the judge is at court, he's gonna go into her room and he's gonna ask her to marry him, but he needs somewhere to hide her while he goes to get the coach for them to flee. They all agree to have her stay at the shop, and Sweeney and Lovett know that this is gonna be a father-daughter reunion situation. Then Pirelli and Tobias come into the shop. Lovett takes Tobias to her shop, she feeds him a pie. Meanwhile, Pirelli drops the Italian accent and is actually Irish and also used to work for Benjamin Barker many years ago, and so then he blackmails Todd into handing over half of his profits into perpetuity. So Todd does the only logical thing and kills Pirelli and shoves him into the chest in his shop. Tobias comes upstairs to try to tell Pirelli about his appointment that he has, and Sweeney's like, oh, he left. You should go ask Mrs. Lovett for another pie, and also a big toddy gin. And he's like, gin? For me? Really? And he gets all excited. And then he goes back, and then Mrs. Lovett kind of adopts Tobias from this point. He just kind of becomes her, like, surrogate child, sort of. Anthony and Joanna meet up, they talk and they kiss, while at the same time the Beadle gives the judge advice on how he's to win Joanna over because Joanna rejected... I forgot to mention in this thing, the judge proposes to Joanna earlier. The judge tells Joanna that he is going to marry her, and then she's like upset about it, and he's like, why is she upset? What's wrong with her? That's important. Anyway, so, the Beadle is giving the judge advice on how to win her over and make her happier about his marriage proposal because they are going to get married the next week. And the Beadle says that he can start trying to win her over by going to get a nice shave and cleaning up a little bit. So the judge goes to Sweeney, they get along very well, and Sweeney takes his time, he really enjoys his moments before killing the judge, as one does. But then just when he's about to do it, Anthony runs in and goes, the plans are all made and Joanna's gonna be there tonight and we're gonna elope. And the judge gets really angry, obviously, and he runs out saying he's gonna hide her somewhere where they're never gonna find her and he will never go back to Sweeney's given the company that he clearly keeps. Sweeney gets very, very angry, reasonably, and sings a song called Epiphany where he basically says he will sort out how to get the judge back, but also everybody is evil and deserves to die, and he declares that it is now his job to help out with the process of depopulation, and so in the meantime he's going to practice his murder skills on them. It's kind of a mental break, a little bit. We'll talk about that later. Mrs. Lovett during this is like, okay, cool, but what about the dead guy upstairs? What's the plan? What's the plan with him? What are we gonna do? And then they come up with the idea to bake him and all of Sweeney's future victims into pies, which they play pretend about different types of people and how they will sell them in a song called A Little Priest, which is hilarious, and they both collapse into giggles over the idea. Super chaotic. Such a switch in tone from the previous song too. It's absolutely genius. It's an incredible way to end Act 1. Like, you are like, what is going on? I've also found that the way that specifically Epiphany and Little Priest are staged between Sweeney and Lovett also tells you the most about the two of them as people and about their interactions with each other, and show the clearest differences between different iterations of Sweeney and Lovett pairs, which is very interesting to me. We're gonna analyze that later. Anyway, Act 2. So, we open on Mrs. Lovett's shop, which is suddenly clean and beautiful and has clearly had serious upgrades in the last however long it has been. Doesn't tell you how long it's been, but it's been some time. The ensemble sings a song about how amazing the pies are, and they're like ready to fight each other over these pies. These people want these pies. Lovett has gone from worst pies in London to best pies in London. Wow, there's so much demand, she's begging Sweeney for more supplies, and by supplies she means dead people, so she can make more pies. And then during this number, Sweeney gets a new mechanical chair that he can switch a lever on and drop his victims into a trapdoor that goes straight down into the bakehouse beneath the shop. So that's a fall of about 20 feet minimum. And then we get the Joanna Quartet after this, where we see Anthony singing about how he's never going to see Joanna again, but he's going to try his hardest to find her anyway. Joanna is alone in a madhouse singing about how she was to be married on Sunday to Anthony. The beggar woman is singing about how there's bad smelling smoke, it's a sign of the devil, there's mischief going on, and the city is on fire, in a way that's trying to tell other people that something is very wrong and she has noticed it, but nobody's listening to her because they think that she's mad, and so nobody listens to what she has to say. And then we have Sweeney, of course, singing about how he may never see Joanna again, but actually he's fine with it because at the end of the day he enjoys the work that he's doing, which he does sing so beautifully while slitting people's throats and chucking them down the chute, and it's really funny. Mrs. Lovett and Sweeney then sit in their parlor, then she sings to him about how she wants to use their new money to travel to the seaside and get married, and Sweeney's like, yeah, anything you say, whatever, but clearly like preoccupied with his thoughts of how to get the judge back into the barbershop. He's not paying attention to her, he never really is. And then Antony runs in saying that he's found Joanna in the madhouse, and Sweeney comes up with the idea to disguise Antony as a wig maker because they often buy their hair from madhouses, go and ask for a specific kind of hair that Joanna has, and then run off with her. Sweeney also writes a letter to the judge saying that the boy has found her and is going to take her to the shop as a way to bait the judge to get the judge back so that he can finally get his revenge on him. In the parlor, Tobias sits with Mrs. Lovett and sings about how he thinks something is odd with Mr. T, and no matter what, he's not going to let anything harm her, not any man or anybody. And she's like, boys and their fancies. Let's not think about these things. Mr. Todd is a very nice man. And he's like, no, I know what I'm saying. I'm not dumb. There's something going on here. And she's like, no, it's fine. Everything's fine. Don't worry about it. And she tries to soothe him by giving him a bonbon that she pulls from her coin purse. The thing is that she stole this coin purse from the dead Pirelli, which Tobias spots and panics. So she manages to finally distract him by offering to finally let him help make the pies. He gets all excited. She brings him down to the bakehouse and then she locks him in. Totally panicking, she goes to find Todd, only to see that the Beetle is in her living room playing music on her harmonium. And she lies like, oh, the bakehouse is locked and Mr. Todd has the key and he won't be back for a while. And the Beetle's like, okay, and then keeps playing music. And she's like, no, he might not be back till tomorrow. And the Beetle's like, okay, well just wait. And she's like, ah. And then meanwhile, Tobias in the bakehouse sings along with what the Beetle is playing and everybody hears it. And she's like, you know, our boy is just, he's simple in the head and he ran off one day. So now we lock him in the bakehouse for his own protection. But no matter what she does, the Beetle will not leave. Then Sweeney arrives. Lovett suggests that he gives the Beetle a free shave. So upstairs they go. And then down the chute goes a dead Beetle. Tobias, meanwhile, was eating pies and having a fairly good time in the bakehouse until he found a long black hair in one of his pies and he's like, that's weird. And then he found a fingernail and he went, huh? And then he sees the Beetle's body come down the chute and he panics, running off to hide elsewhere in the bakehouse. Antony, in the asylum, gets Joanna, but then cannot shoot the gun at Fogg to get her free because he's kind of a little bit of a coward, but it's okay, we roll with it. So she grabs a gun, she shoots him herself, and then everybody in the madhouse runs free and into the streets. Joanna dresses up as a boy and Antony leaves her in Sweeney's shop for safety while he goes to make the rest of the plans for their flight to elope. The beggar woman continues trying to tell anybody that she possibly can that there's something wrong going on at the bakehouse and somebody needs to investigate it. She sees the Beetle go into Sweeney's and she assumes that he might be able to help because, you know, police, so she goes after him. Meanwhile, Sweeney and Lovett are in the bakehouse trying to track down Tobias to figure out what to do with this boy so that he'll just stop screaming and raising more attention to what's going on because their cover is about to be blown. The beggar woman wanders up into the shop calling Beetle, and Joanna hears it and she's like, oh my gosh, somebody's calling the Beetle to come after me. So she jumps into the chest to hide just as the beggar woman enters into the shop. The woman walks around, she touches everything, she points at things, she whimpers, she cries, she opens a window, she mimes picking up and cradling an imaginary baby, she sings a little bit of a lullaby, and then Sweeney runs in, sees that the judge is on his way and he's like, I don't have time for this, kills the woman, sends her down the chute. He then does the same thing to the judge, he savors a little bit more, there's a song, you know. And then Joanna climbs out of the chest and Sweeney panics and shoves her into the chair, about to kill her as well. This part, the first time I saw it, I was freaking out. I was like, oh my gosh, he's gonna kill his own child. But then a scream arises from the bakehouse, which distracts him for a second, and so then she jumps out of the chair and runs off to find Antony. Sweeney runs to the bakehouse to see Mrs. Lovett, who had been screaming because the judge was not in fact yet dead and he grabbed her skirt. They try to drag the judge and the woman to the ovens, and then Mrs. Lovett screams at Sweeney to not touch the woman, and he gets angry because he's like, she's just some meddling old beggar woman, and then he looks at her face and realizes that she is his Lucy and she'd been alive the whole time. And Mrs. Lovett had said that she had taken the arsenic, but not that she had died, and she said that because Mrs. Lovett knew she would be a better wife than what Lucy had become, and because she loves him, and so that's what she wanted to do, and it was deliberately calculated of her. He stands up, smiling, and starts singing to Lovett about how smart and practical she is. He starts dancing with her, dancing her over to the furnace, and then chucking her inside. And then he goes and cries over Lucy's dead body. Shortly after this, Tobias wanders in after seeing all of this and recites nursery rhymes and otherwise babbles about random things. He picks up Sweeney's razor, and then he kills Sweeney, who dies onto Lucy, and they like die clutching each other, at which point Antony, Joanna, and 2 police officers enter. There's an epilogue song that almost precisely mirrors the opening song, but with a whole new context. It's stunning. I've also seen some versions where when Tobias walks over to the razor and grabs the razor and goes to Sweeney, Sweeney lifts his head up to expose his neck because he knows it's coming and he's ready for it, which is a fascinating directorial choice. I've seen about half the adaptations do that and the other half have not. We'll talk about different directorial choices at the end of this video. But there you go. That's what we're working with here. It is so much, and it's incredible. I don't majorly love a lot of the productions of it that I saw. We'll get into that later, but the story itself and the script in particular is spectacular, and it's so specific, but it also is so expansive and gives you so much to work with and so like many character choices that you can make. So here's a curtain call of the current Broadway version, and then let's talk about themes and history and stuff. Sondheim often spoke about how the central piece of what this show is about is obsession. Sweeney's obsession over revenge, Lovett's obsession over Sweeney, the judge's obsession over Joanna, Joanna's obsession over freedom, Antony's and Pirelli's and Tobias's, etc. I could go on, you get the idea, right? He kind of felt like it was a small horror piece, a sort of melodrama about one man's obsession, but then Hal Prince, the director of the original Broadway production, expanded that to be a story about wider capitalism, about a broken system that picks people up, churns them through, and spits them back out as broken people who will do horrible things in the name of survival, turning Sweetie Todd into a sort of fallen hero, a guy who is a product of his surroundings, both a victim and perpetrator, and that the machine of industrialization turns people into objects rather than humans, causing the absolute breakdown of humanity as a whole. What I wouldn't give to have seen Hal Prince direct a Sophie Treadwell play, oh my gosh. Now, Sondheim has openly said that he kind of disagrees with this idea. He doesn't think Sweeney is a product of his time, but rather a man bent on personal revenge the way we all are in one way or another. But also so many of the lyrics he wrote very clearly and deliberately reflect Prince's ideas, most notably the last song where they basically say that Sweeney could be any one of us or anybody we pass on the street any day. So clearly they sorted it out, whatever happened there. I personally think that both can be true at the same time. Clearly they also thought that, though particularly with the Tim Burton adaptation, you can see Sondheim had a hand in it and Prince did not, in that it lost a lot of the anti-capitalist subtext and frankly text. But there's also There's also other research into how Sondheim tends to handle disability that makes me inclined to believe that what works about it in this production comes more from the book writer Hugh Wheeler and Hal Prince than from Sondheim himself, but let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Now the reason I bring this up now is because when it comes to the show's portrayal of madness, it really muddies the water around what insanity versus sanity actually is and how that is impacted by one's direct environment, by who is in charge and by what behavior is deemed crazy versus sane, showing how subjective and ever-changing the view of that concept really is. Now, if you're new to my channel, hi, welcome. Brief history of disability. Disabled as a category was created to group who was capable of working efficiently and who was not. Those who could not were considered the deserving poor, i.e. they can get aid from the government, and those who could were required to work. That's a very simple explanation. There's also the fact that disabled rich folks or older folks could be paid to be taken care of, so there's some privilege there, and not all people worked. The general definition also kind of carried over in the sense of like, if you as a woman refuse to get married, you are therefore insane and should be put into a madhouse as well. So we see a lot of that. In times of economic prosperity, usually directly after major wars, the disability category typically increases in size and that more things legally count as disability and more resources are given out because we want to support veterans to get more people to enlist in the military. This is a lot less of a thing that we see in recent history, but it definitely was a thing after World War I and World War II. In times of economic hardship, like right now, the category drastically decreases despite the same amount of people struggling. So when it comes to the era we were talking about in this show where workhouses and madhouses were overrun and there were too many people in the cities and not enough places or jobs for them and no resources for anybody, that category was very, very small. But getting back to the concept of madness, which we can also describe as neurodivergence or mental disability, I go with the verbiage of the era here, so I'm using madness. What we categorize as mentally ill is often person is unable to do precisely what we want them to and the way that we want them to do it. We need to administer care so that they can be able to do the thing that we want them to do in the most productive and efficient way possible. Like, yes, it is disabling in the sense of like mental illness has a lot of distressing experiences involved in it. It does prevent me from living my life in the way that I want to sometimes. So getting care to learn coping mechanisms and whatnot is important and helpful. So I'm not saying that mental disabilities aren't also impairments that are like actively impairing life. But what I am saying is that mental illness has historically been used as a coercive tool. For example, drapetomania I don't know if I pronounced that right, but was a mental disease coined in 1851 by Samuel Cartwright that afflicted slaves by making them want to run away from slavery, and they were mentally ill because why would a slave want to leave slavery? We have many diagnoses in the DSM that are parallel to each other, but one is used primarily for people of color and the other is primarily for white people. We also have the same situation with disorders for men versus women. And also, like, even today, I've seen countless stories of folks being referred to psychologists to learn to deal with their COVID anxiety because it's getting in the way of life, as if that's not like a very legitimate concern to currently have for very many people. Looking at mental illness as a social construct does not mean that these experiences are not real, but rather that they do not constitute a fixed or objective category across time and space. Like race, like gender, like all illness and other forms of deviance from the norm, the concept of madness and mental illness have been molded in a particular social, political, and economic context, and would look different in a liberated future. That's from the book Mad World. I have it here, The Politics of Mental Health. I'm only part way through it right now, but it's fantastic and I highly recommend it. It basically talks about how capitalism is what is causing the vast majority of mental illness and how we need to look at these concepts more broadly and acknowledge the context in which they find themselves. For me, I try to look at mental disability in reverse. I firmly believe that neurotypical people are not a real thing. They do not exist. I will link my video about that up here. And I go into every single interaction with people that I meet assuming they're neurodivergent unless proven otherwise, which has never been proven otherwise, and interact with people from that level of understanding instead. Absolute life changer. Highly recommend if you struggle with social cues and social situations. This helps with anxiety a lot, I found. But yeah, the point here is that capitalism and wider social norms are the overarching mechanisms that decide who is mad and who is not. And more specifically, that people in power are usually the ones who decide that. So the fact that the show is so uncertain of who is actually mentally disabled and who isn't, with the exception of the beggar woman. And also when we talk about the show, we tend to use language of disability and madness for nearly every single principal character. Like, I'm sure that you've heard people be like, oh my gosh, like Mrs. Lovett and Sweeney are absolutely insane. Like, we talk about that all the time. I've heard reviews refer to Annalise Lovett as bonkers on several occasions, and they're not wrong, but like, it's fascinating to me. There's also something to be said about the fact that these characters are common archetypes used in opera, such as the young lovers and the witch and the antihero, which are very similar to their commedia dell'arte counterparts, which we know more or less originated from mimicking mentally disabled people. So by default, all of these are therefore mad, but we're gonna table that. We don't have time. Once I get going about commedia, there's no stopping me, so we're just gonna ignore that. But I don't even know which video I talked about. I've talked about that in 2 different videos. I think if you want to learn more about the history of commedia in relation to mental disability, I would say watch my Disability in Shakespeare's Era Renaissance video. Great. Now, Sweeney Todd has a very extensive history before Sondheim, with first records of the story dating very far back. We're gonna untangle the mess of where this originated shortly, but for now, we're gonna focus on the first time we met Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Lovett as characters, and we're gonna work from there. Now, in 1846 and 1847, through those 2 years, it was a continuous thing. A series of penny dreadfuls, which are cheap literature that came out in a series, usually following detectives, criminals, or vampires. They were really common in this era. Think of it as modern true crime, but in a serial thing where like a few chapters were published each week and you had to go out and buy them for a penny. This series was titled The String of Pearls, or The Sailor's Gift, a romance of peculiar interest, and it was published over the course of a year. Lots of different authors are credited here depending on which source that you read, but the 2 main ones that always come up here are James Malcolm Rymer and Thomas Peckett Prest. It was printed as a novel in 1850 at a grand total of 732 pages, titled The String of Pearls, or The Barber of Fleet Street, a domestic romance. I have so much to say about this book. I read the entire thing. I did it via audiobook because, first of all, 732 pages is terrifying, and second of all, I can only read books when they're in physical print, and I had spent too much money in this video already to try to justify that when a free audiobook was at my disposal. It's 12 hours long, if anybody is wondering. Now, you know what, actually, before I tell you about how wild this book is, let me show you what I made during the time of listening to this book, because I like to keep my hands busy, and I'm proud of it, and this is the only time you're gonna get to see it. First, we have this painting. I started this painting. Can you see it? You can see it. I started this painting during my Wicked video, and when I was reading the original Wicked, and I didn't finish it. It was sitting on my floor for like 3 months because that was in October, and now it's done. I did it. I also, image description, it has jars of flowers in lots of different pastel colors. And then I also painted this jar. And it looks really cool. I need to steal it so that this all stays because it's all chalk paint. But yeah, it's ombre, like sunset-ish. It starts with yellow on the side and it goes to blue in the middle. It was really fun. I had a really, really good time doing those things. But yeah, that long. So yeah, the book is needlessly long, which you can assume by the page count, but I genuinely am quite convinced that these guys were paid by the word. I don't have any other proof of that, but it is true. There's no way that it is not true. It is the only explanation. Let me reenact to you what every single dialogue felt like. This is not exact quotes. This is my, just for the vibes. Ready? Okay, here we go. Dearest friend, I'm about to tell you the most horrible, terrible, awful thing you were ever to hear. Goodness, I shall be sat here quite willing to listen to what awful story you have to say. I'm ever supporting of you in your time of need. Oh, thank you. That is so good to hear. It's just one of the most deeply disturbing things I've ever witnessed, and it has caused me so much sorrow and distress. This, reader, is such a horrid tale of darkness that she's about to tell to her friend. You will be so interested to hear what sorts of deep, terrible things she has to say. And it goes on like that, page after page. Also, the audiobook reader didn't change voices between the characters, so if you zoned out, you didn't know what was happening because everything was so wordy. I will say the last 5 or so chapters were actually very well organized and a good time. I enjoyed the last 5 chapters, but like at what cost, right? Like 5 it's like a 30-something chapter book. The thing that bothered me more about it though than just like how wordy it was that on page 1 we see Tobias Ragg, Sweeney's apprentice, show up for the first day of work, and Sweeney gives him a huge lecture about how he must, under no circumstances, snoop in any of Sweeney's things, or ask any questions about what goes on at the barbershop, or talk to anybody outside of the barbershop about what he sees, hears, or thinks he sees and hears, under punishment of death, which he then explains how he's going to kill him. Followed by 730 pages of people going, huh, I know minimum 3 different people who went to Sweeney Todd's for a shave and then disappeared afterwards. Also, that apprentice of Todd's looks really old and haggard for how young he is. And if you ask him questions, he just kind of starts crying, and he's also covered in bruises. It's so bizarre. What a mystery this is. Whatever could be going on. Like, everybody's just fine with the fact that, no joke, hundreds of people have gone missing over the last 8 years. Most of them more on the wealthy side, which is a smaller class of people. Like, sure, London's big. But is it really that big? Is it sorry, calming myself. Anyway, this story is very different from the plot that we know and love. The most notable thing that Sweeney is so clearly the worst ever person from the moment that we meet him. There's no anti-hero situation, no revenge situation. He just sucks and wants to hoard wealth. It's obvious that he sucks. Lovett also sucks. We'll get to her. First, the plot also takes place 60 or so years earlier, in 1785. So Sweeney wears a tricorn. I'm glad that we've changed the time period because Sweeney in a tricorn would be real weird. And I also think it's kind of cute that they made this story take place in the exact year that the original story was published. I don't know, that just brings me joy for some reason. Mr. Thornhill is a sailor guy, and he has a very devoted dog named Hector, and he's on a mission to go to the house of the spectacle maker because his daughter, Joanna Oakley, was engaged to his best friend Mark Angistry, who vanished at sea and entrusted Thornhill with a string of pearls that he was to give her upon his return. Also, Mark told Joanna a specific day that he was going to return, or if he did not return, somebody else would give her a message from him. So she's waiting because this is the appointed day that she is going to learn what has happened to her fiance. But Thornhill decides, you know what, I'm gonna just get a quick shave because I've been at sea for a while on my way to Joanna's house. Why not? We learn that Sweeney is terrified of dogs, so he leaves Hector outside. And then Sweeney sends apprentice Tobias Ragg off on an errand during the appointment. And then when Tobias returns, he sees the man is gone, but Hector the dog has not. And Hector seems very agitated and eventually goes into the closet and takes out his master's hat and runs away. And Tobias is like, huh? What? This is weird. And then the dog stays outside Sweeney's for many days, and Sweeney doesn't like it, obviously, because it's drawing a crowd, and also dogs scare him, and then the dog disappears at some point, and that is never brought up again. Like, the instinct would be that Sweeney killed the dog? But unclear. Meanwhile, Joanna waits anxiously for news of her Mark because it's the appointed day, but she hears nothing and she begins to panic. The next day she gets information to meet a man at the Temple Gardens at a certain time to learn about what's happened to her beloved. She's like, oh phew, he's just a day delayed. And this man is Colonel Jeffrey, and he tells her that Mark's ship disappeared and Thornhill had the pearls to give to her from Mark, but now Thornhill is also missing. And Joanna begins to think, huh, maybe Thornhill went missing at Todd's because that's where they ended up tracing his last movements to, and also his dog was there for a couple days. And she also thinks that maybe Thornhill was her Mark because Mark said that he was going to change his name when he went out to sea, and why would Mark be like, my ship's about to disappear. Here, Thornhill, take these pearls and give them to her on this specific day in case I do not return home, rather than, huh, let's both climb into this lifeboat together, you know? Also, at some point, Jeffrey makes an advance on Joanna, and she very firmly tells him that she only sees him as a friend, and I'm kind of obsessed with like this kick-butt lady version that we have of her in the original story. Anyway, the side action during this is that Tobias is getting really uneasy about what's going on, but Sweeney's blackmailing him, saying that if he tells anybody, he's gonna get his mother sent to be hanged, so Tobias is just disintegrating into anxiety, which the locals see and notice and comment upon, and no one says anything to try to do anything about it. Also, Sweeney goes out and he tries to sell the stolen string of pearls 2 different times, maybe 3. I don't remember. This bit of the book really dragged and was unclear what was going on. But one of the times he ends up in a high-speed chase and ends up needing to wear an eye patch after. That's mentioned in like one line and never again, but it's also the only thing I was able to find in any version in reference to the fact of like his skin was pale and his eye was odd, which is a line about him in the opening song of the musical. So I'm not sure about that line in the musical, I'm not sure whatever, but at least in the original his eye is in fact odd. So that does exist somewhere. Todd is eventually able to sell the pearls for a considerable sum of money under a false identity, and then Colonel Jeffrey decides to get the magistrate involved in this investigation about where Thornhill went because he feels really weird about it all. And also there's a notably bad smell coming from the crypts underneath St. Dunstan's church to the point where a visiting bishop gets angry about it. That will come back later. We also meet Mrs. Lovett running the most famous pie shop in the entire region and described as young, buxom, good-looking, and with a lurking devil in her eye. Everybody finds her attractive, but everybody's also terrified of her and, quote, there seems to be some singular and hidden meaning in every word she utters, which is the correct assumption because she has a rule that whoever she hires to work in her bakehouse is locked in there permanently, not allowed to leave, unpaid, and is only allowed pies and water to live off of. They are free to leave when they are done with the situation, but by that she means that once her worker becomes a shell of a person and no longer wants to make her pies, she gets a hitman to take them out and replaces them with another person. A, quote, destitute, ragged wretch by the name of Jarvis Williams shows up one day at her pie shop, asks her for a job. She's like, sounds great. My last man just left, and then she puts him into the bakehouse. The previous guy fell apart after about 6 weeks. The timeline of this book is really unclear. It seems like Jarvis really only got to a week, if even, before he started to lose it. The timeline of, you'd think that they had time in the 732 pages to tell you what their timeline was, but no. No, we do. I would assume that the whole thing takes place in maximum 2 weeks. Probably less than maybe just a week. I don't know. Anyway, speaking of people not lasting long, Tobias sorts out that Sweeney's a murderer very quickly, and eventually he tries to tell his mother, and Sweeney is like, wow, this poor child has gone mad, just like my last apprentice. I will bring him to Mr. Fogg's asylum. So that's what he does. It's well known that those who go there die in a natural way before many years, and if I understood correctly, Sweeney's former apprentice recently died while at Fogg's asylum. Fogg murders inmates when he gets tired of dealing with them. We're going to talk about the asylum after we finish with the plot summary, because there's a lot to be said about the portrayal of madness in this book. It's kind of why I read it. But I will also mention that Mr. Fogg's is a private asylum, which is why it is separate from Bedlam, which was a public asylum, and therefore Sweeney paid Fogg a yearly fee for Tobias to stay there. Private asylums were supposedly better for the patients and rich people lived there. Does not mean they actually got better care. Often just means that the heads of the place just took all of the money for themselves and treated the inmates the same as they would at a public madhouse. I think this carries across to the musical as well, because we know that Lucy ended up in Bedlam, but Joanna did not, and Bedlam was the only public madhouse at the time that I can find historically, so Joanna was also in private care. So it being a private asylum did carry across into all of the versions. Anyway, so Toby's in the madhouse, starting to lose it. Jarvis is in the bakehouse, starting to lose it. Joanna is starting to lose it because she needs to know if Thornhill was her mark, so she decides to become an investigative journalist and dress as a boy and become Sweeney's new apprentice. Jeffrey and the magistrate are beginning to investigate in their own way, and there's a formal investigation underway trying to figure out what is going on in the crypts under the church to source the smell and make it go away so the bishop won't be angry at them. Colonel Jeffrey and the magistrate get involved in this investigation and also learn about Joanna's plan, and so they send Joanna information about how they're going to come undercover later and how she is to help them. And Toby learns that Fogg is going to kill him that night. He meets a pretty girl at the asylum and they escape together. They pull all this together in the final 2 chapters spectacularly. So anyway, final 2 chapters, or final 3. I did something like that. Lovett tells Jarvis to make the 9 p.m. batch of pies. He agrees. He instead uses this time to try to break through the bakehouse wall to get out of the bakehouse. Sweeney goes to Lovett's for a meeting. He tells Joanna, disguised as a boy named Charlie, to watch the shop. While he is out, she lets in 2 police officers and hides them in the closet. During the meeting, we learn that Lovett is having a bit of a Lady Macbeth moment. She's really regretting everything she's done over the last few years. She's becoming an alcoholic to cope with it, and she wants to quit the business, and she's angry at Sweeney for keeping so much of the profit from the expensive things he steals from the dead people, and he tells her that he's going to give her a very large sum of money from the pearls, and then they can both retire. But then he sneaks poison into her brandy because he does not intend to share any of his wealth. He goes back to the shop angrily and sees a man come in for the shave. This man, the magistrate in disguise, if I remember correctly, he's in on it, whoever he is. I think it's the magistrate. He says all the right things to make him the prime victim for Sweeney, and then when Sweeney leaves the room to run the mechanism chair's trapdoor to kill him, this Sweeney basically, he leaves the room, he pulls a lever on the chair, it drops the trapdoor below it, and the person falls about 20 feet onto the hard stone floor, and then he goes down there to polish them off with a razor if he needs to, and then he steals all their stuff. The man gets out of the chair and watches what happens and sees the chair drop. When Sweeney returns, he yells, "Murderer!" and then the policemen come in out of the closet and they arrest Sweeney. Turns out during the crypt investigation, they had discovered the trapdoor situation, so they knew how this worked. Also, Tobias, after having escaped, went straight to the authorities and they used his information to help crack the code, and somewhere in there they also discovered Jarvis. So, or maybe they got a note to Jarvis. Jarvis got involved in this somehow. At 9 p.m., when Lovett pulls up the pulley for the pie, she finds the pulley extra heavy. Eventually he's able to pull it up, but turns out that Jarvis was on the pulley underneath a tray of pies, and he's about to escape via that, and then she is also arrested. But then the poison kicks in, so she dies before she can go to jail, and Jarvis tells everybody the pies are made of people, and everybody is horrified. And then we learn that Jarvis is actually Mark Angistry, who thought that after watching Colonel Jeffrey profess love to Joanna, that she had left him for another man, so in his despair he decided to go work at Lovett's. But now he learns that wasn't true. And they live happily ever after. Also, the pearls appear and disappear and reappear a lot throughout. They're like a narrative thing. And we learn that they've been working on killing people for over 8 years and probably killed hundreds of people because there's several cases where he kills 2 people in one day. But really, this all could have taken place in a neat 200 pages and been an incredible book that would have probably still remained popular today. And honestly, I really enjoyed the last third of it. So obviously the story that we know today is a far cry from that version. I also feel inclined to mention that there is a whole section where it talks about how Thornhill and Colonel Jeffrey became such close friends on the ship that it was a, quote, almost romantic friendship that arose between them, which is followed up by like extensive backpedaling where they like explained like, oh, it's a normal thing for men on long sea voyages to become very, very, very close with each other, which isn't wrong, but it's also just gay. Like, it's just gay. It brought me joy. I enjoyed having a little bit of homosexuality along with my murder and cannibalism. Anyway, the interesting thing for me, sticking with the madness theme, is that this book was very self-aware about the madness stuff. It specifically, when introducing the concept of the madhouse, talked about how this was an era where mad people were treated terribly and punished for things that they could not help, and that if they were wrongfully imprisoned and tried to speak out, it would only serve as further proof of his mental disorder. When Tobias met the girl, they gave her a full chapter or 2 to tell her entire story about how she'd been abused all of her life, and eventually sent there so that her property could be stolen, and then never mentioned her again, which to me implies that she existed solely to emphasize the fact that some people end up at madhouses without actually being mad all of the time. They also talked about how being in that place, Tobias's thoughts quickly became scrambled and confused, and he couldn't stand it, and he acted out violently at one point. There was so much care taken to explain that madhouses were terrible places, and we know so much more now in 1846 than we did 60 years ago when the story takes place, but they're still miserable and dark and bleak and used as a means of control in putting people away. And we're going to talk about the historical context of madness and institutionalization in this era shortly, but I was very surprised by how progressive this book was in talking about it for this era, especially in a text whose primary goal was to entertain and sell copies and tell about grisly murders, and then in the middle they added just like a ton of social commentary about madhouses and insanity that didn't need to be there. And I'm still confused as to like, what? Why? And also like they knew the same stuff about madness that like the all of the stuff that I'm, you know, telling you about, what's it called? About Mad World, talking about how politics and society creates madness. And they were talking about that using very similar language in this 1846 writing. And it's just, I still can't wrap my brain around why that was there or what possessed them to do that, or, you know, like I feel like today we're like, oh, that's such a progressive idea, but they were having these ideas in 1846? What? Now, before the original series had even published its conclusion, a guy named George David Pitt, who was known for being kind of a grifter, turned it into a play titled The String of Pearls, The Fiend of Fleet Street. There are not any extant pieces of the play. I, for one, would love to know precisely where the story was cut off when he wrote this, but there is a playbill of it from which we know that they added comic characters, they added a moral lesson, they added the razor cuts as part of the murder, they added music, including a choral number starting Act 2 about how great Lovett's pies were. I know. Then Joanna went to the asylum with Tobias in this version, and they replaced Hector the dog with a black child, so that's, you know, racism. It then appeared as a play in 1865 somewhere else. In 1928 we got our first surviving film version of the story, and in 1936 was the first film version with sound. In this one, Sweeney became less of a comically over-the-top bad character, more of a campy, scary guy. Also, I did not watch or read any of the film adaptations or any play adaptations between 1850 and 1973 because I ran out of time. And I also don't like really spooky things. I can do spooky things on stage because I know how that works, if that makes sense. But there is an awesome YouTube channel titled The Drama Dorks that did a breakdown of the history of the adaptation with this intellectual property that I will link below that you should definitely go watch. I got very overwhelmed going through the earliest records, which we'll talk about after the section, and they helped clarify things for me a great deal in that video, and I just really appreciate them for that. In 1956, Stanley Holloway released a song titled Sweeney Todd the Barber based on a 1935 poem by R.P. Weston and Bert Lee. The poem's obviously older, so in regards to timeline of adaptation, it's not super relevant, but it was apparently a part of a lot of British childhoods and therefore cemented the story further into our culture. Mrs. Lovett and Sweeney are lovers in this one, meaning that the plotline had been around since at least before the first sound film, if not earlier, because they're not lovers in the original book, but yeah. In 1959, there's a ballet version at the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre in Stratford. In 1970, Andy Milligan's Bloodthirsty Butchers came out, which is a super violent film adaptation. And then in 1973, we get the basis for Sondheim's version. This is, of course, the play titled Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, written by Christopher Bond, performed at the Theatre Royal in Stratford East in London. Sondheim saw this while visiting London and decided that he wanted to make it a musical, got permission from Bond, and got to work. Bond wrote the introduction to the script that I have here. This is also the script. I bought this at the Drama Bookshop, but you can also buy it if you go see the show. You can also buy it online. It's great. The intermission section has photos from the original production, which brings me joy. But yeah, his introduction to this is fantastic and taught me a lot. But basically the story is he was working as an actor at a theater. They had a really great success performing another melodrama, so they decided to do Sweeney. But then when a copy of the script came, and they got it 2 weeks before rehearsals, it was boring and generally not great. And since Bond had recently had a novel published, he offered to rewrite the thing in a week. In his words, it didn't need doctoring, it needed a heart transplant, and preferably new lungs and balls as well. He kept the bones of it, but he added some elements of Dumas's The Count of Monte Cristo with Turner's The Revenger's Tragedy, added elements of pastiche Shakespeare in a sort of blankish version for Sweeney, the judge, and the lovers to talk, borrowed the name of the author of The Prisoner of Zelda for my sailor boy, remembered some market patter I'd learned as a child, and adapted the wit and wisdom of Brenda, who ran the greengrocer shop opposite my house, for Mrs. Lovett's ruminations upon life, death, and the state of her sex life. He played Tobias Ragg in that production, and basically says he did an okay job, but then Sondheim worked absolute magic on it. There's also a lot of poison in the original play, some major changes that may or may not matter, but I think that they're interesting. So many of the lines here are virtually identical, if not actually identical to the musical, and you can see where certain things inspired songs and whatnot, which is super cool. It feels a bit like looking at a piece of the artistic process, sort of. The most major change is that Joanna becomes Sweeney's daughter, and as the Drama Dorks astutely pointed out, basically becomes the Pearls from the original story, and that she has lost a lot of her autonomy, and she's handed off and passed around and needs to be found and rescued throughout the story. She gets to be disguised as a boy at the end, but she doesn't get the fun, like, shenanigans and investigative journalism here. But the rest of the characters got much more complexity than they ever had before, particularly with Sweeney, whose motivation went from wanting lots of money to wanting revenge, becoming more of a fallen hero than just a cartoonish bad guy. He's also genuinely attracted to Lovett, and they have a whole thing going in this one. And also Lovett is weirdly into the murder situation in comparison to the musical, where she's like spooked at first, but then kind of goes along with it. She's a lot more nefarious in this version than in the musical, specifically trying to poison Beetle at one point and explicitly telling Sweeney that Lucy is dead, and she thinks it would have been better if Ben and Lucy had just accepted the fact that she was going to be with the judge a few times a month and get over their noble ways or whatever, which I thought was real weird and victim blamey. Also, Antony and Lovett both know Sweeney's real identity. Pirelli is Cockney rather than Irish, and the judge tells Antony that he is taking Joanna to the madhouse. And we also learn that Tobias went to the workhouse at age 7 when his mother died, and then Pirelli took him in from there as an apprentice. Most interestingly, the beggar woman is an apparently non-disabled woman. After her assault, she went home, she poisoned both herself and her baby. Somehow Joanna ended up in Lovett's care for a few days before the judge took her, and the beggar woman is just being a person on the street begging for alms without any semblance of perceived madness to her. She literally goes around telling people, maybe don't eat these pies, I think there's something wrong with them, which is quite a tone shift from the musical. I read this after watching 3 or 4 productions and I was almost off-put by that, honestly. It felt weird and like wrong. Also, Sweeney repents his actions at the end, and the play ends on Antony and Joanna deciding to get married, which is weird. I like it ending on the shock of Tobias sputtering nonsense around a lot of dead bodies. I think that has more of an impact. I will link the play below. It's fairly short and it's a very cool read in comparison to the musical that we know and love, which opened in 1979 with the music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, book by Hugh Wheeler, and direction by Harold or Hal Prince, titled Sweeney Todd the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, a musical thriller. They won 8 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, Book, and Performance by a Leading Actress for Angela Lansbury, of course. And we're going to talk about the characterization of the different adaptations later, but my favorite tidbit from this one was the line, "At last my right arm is complete again," which is in the script as such. When performed by Len Cariou, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, as "At last my arm is complete again." And I was really confused as to why they changed it but left it in the script, and I learned that Len was a lefty because he was writing with his left hand in another scene, and therefore they had to change the line because he was a lefty, which really brought me joy. The show was open at the Uris Theatre, now the Gershwin where Wicked lives. Ironically, I did 2 Gershwin shows in a row for the series. Anyway, it was open for 557 performances and 19 previews from March 1979 to June 1980. After this, there are many tours and regional productions and whatnot. The performance history of this piece is beyond massive. I pared it down to just a handful of things I found important. So the show transferred over to Theatre Royal Drury Lane in London in 1980. It also had a US national tour the same year. The first Broadway revival was in 1989 at the Circle in the Square Theatre, which I had the chance to watch at the New York Public Library. It was on a thrust stage, so the audience was on 3 of the 4 sides. In 2002, there was a Kennedy Center production starring Brian Stokes Mitchell. I did not get a chance to watch that. In 2004 was the second revival that started in London and then transferred to Broadway in 2005. It was directed by John Doyle, starring Michael Cerveris and Patti LuPone, where the cast played the instruments themselves. Very minimalist. I honestly felt that by being more minimalist, it felt more muddled. We'll talk about that later. That was at the Eugene O'Neill Theatre. Also, Patti LuPone danced around the stage playing the tuba during God That's Good, which is one of my favorite things I think to ever happen. Then in 2007 we get the Tim Burton film adaptation with Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter. That was a film, more on that later, and 2017 was an off-Broadway revival at the Barrow Street Theatre, the cast of which was absolutely stacked. I could not find any recordings of this either, so it will not be referenced henceforth. And then in 2023, the third Broadway revival opened at the Lunt-Fontanne Theatre, starring Josh Groban and Anna Lee Ashford. This is my favorite of all the productions by far. I have now seen it twice. I'm seeing it again just a couple days after this video comes out. It's way too much fun, and if you can get a ticket, I highly, highly recommend it. I'll gush about this one later. Now, the next and most obvious question is, was Sweeney Todd a real guy? Because depending on what you Google, the answer can be yes, no, or maybe. The actual answer is most probably not, but it's complicated. And that brings us to the very origins of this tale. There are 4 different places the story is sort of attributed to coming from. Technically 5 if you count the random researcher who said there was a Sweeney Todd and gave specific dates and information that literally nobody else has ever been able to find or track down, and people question his work a lot, so we're gonna ignore that one. No. The first in chronological order is a 1784 report of a barber near Fleet Street who thought the guy he was shaving was sleeping with his wife, and so he cut the victim's throat. The second is a late 1700s record of a criminal named Sawney Bean housed at the Newgate prison for robbing passersby and then eating them. The third is in 1818, a guy named James Catnach, who was a big gossiper, decided to write and publish a ballad claiming, with no proof, that a specific butcher on Drury Lane was using human meat. He was sued for malicious libel and went to jail for it, with one of his competitors publishing a follow-up ballad about the saga. And the fourth and seemingly most promising is an 1816 archived police report called Rue de la Harpe from Joseph Fouché, the Minister of Police in Paris, documenting a series of murders from 1800 where a Parisian barber was killing people and then baking them into pies and selling them. That original archive is missing, and there are 2 important trends going on at the time that give us a little bit more information about this. The first is the fact that the era had a lot of serial killers that people like to learn and hear about. Jack the Ripper is the most prominent example people know about today. He operated a few decades after this was written, but similar vibes. It also had a lot of stories published in papers, exaggerated a lot for sensational purposes, many of which weren't real to begin with, but claimed to be true stories in the same way that historically people in freak shows had absolutely true stories about why they looked or acted the way that they did, aka not actually a true story. And much of the population was not literate to begin with, so it was very easy for things to get wilder and wilder as time went on and stories were telephoned through several people. The second thing is that during this era, cannibalistic stories about the post-revolution French were regularly told as anti-French, anti-revolution propaganda. And the fact that we don't actually have that police archive, I mean, think what you want to think, I have a feeling that a murdering pie maker was not a real French guy. Prest, one of the authors of the original series, was known for skimming the paper for ideas for his stories, so it could have been based on any one of these stories published as true crime that may or may not have been real. Honestly, we will never know, but the fact that there were 14th century ballads about a murderous barber and baker working together, and that stories about people committing murder and then serving the murdered person for dinner can be traced all the way back to Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus and even farther to Ovid's Metamorphoses and to straight up Greek mythology, this concept has been in the cultural consciousness for a very long time, to the point where when I asked my roommate about this, she said she took a class in college that had a whole unit about different plays in history where people are baked into pies and fed to people. So statistically, there is probably some serial killer somewhere on the planet who knew one of these stories and was like, OMG, wouldn't it be cool if I reenacted this? But as far as records go, we don't seem to know about it, at least in a specific pre-Sweeney context. But that brings us into the historical context of Sweeney Todd. The musical takes place when the original story was written, 1846, while the original story takes place in 1785. 1846, Victorian era London. Not a great time. I say that with a caveat of no time in history is a great time. Humans are gonna human history is soup and nothing ever actually majorly changes about the world. We just pretend that it does so we feel like we've advanced as a species. Anyway, also, shout out to various theater companies who made their dramaturgy research packets publicly available PDFs. I appreciate you. Not shout out for how much Freudian character analysis was in those packets, because I would like to think that theater can be a bit more updated with its understanding of psychology, but also, why am I kidding myself? The fact that theater people think that they inherently understand modern psychology when they don't is the primary source of ableism within the industry, so why would this be any different? Moving on. At this time, London was one of the most populated cities in the world, and it was very much not ready for that. The Great Fire of 1666 destroyed over 85% of the city, which was then rebuilt rather haphazardly and speedily because with increased industrialization, people were moving to the city for jobs, which caused a wild surge in population, creating more need for haphazard building and shoving people into literally any crevice possible. This led to lots of issues with things like sewage running in the streets, buildings randomly falling apart, having lots of narrow and unlit passageways that were great places for crime, and creepy things, lots of slums and unhoused folks, generally high crime rates, and lots of things smelled really bad all of the time, because in addition to the sewage in the streets, butchers would dump stuff out in the streets as well. Most people got their water straight from the Thames via open aqueducts that were full of literally every gross thing to ever exist, to the point where most people just drank gin instead of water. This fact led me to the major rabbit hole of this project that doesn't matter, but it also does, which is covering up a perceived plot hole of if butchers were throwing animal entrails into the street and nobody batted an eye, and London was known for how badly it smelled, especially around Fleet Street, why was Sweeney Todd ratted out for murder due to smell rather than, say, all the disappearing people, because aren't humans just meat, so why would that be any different? Fleet Street at the time, by the way, was the center of journalism in the print district and the connecting route between the two major centers of London, so it was very busy all the time, hence why it was specifically known for how bad it smelled. It is obviously the main plot point in the original 1846 version, so it was believable at the time as a concept, but in that version it was an issue of the church smelling bad, a place that would likely not smell like rotting meat on the daily. In the modern version, it's about a place that was expected to butcher meat smelling bad, which is a whole different story. So here's the logistical discussion of what Sweeney and Lovett were probably doing and how they got them caught. Yes, I did spend several hours talking this through with a friend who knows things about the mortuary arts. If you want to skip this bit, go to this time code. Okay, so there are two different smells discussed in the script. The first is the chimney and smoke from the chimney. That's where City on Fire comes from. The second is the bakehouse, though that is only referenced when Tobias goes into the bakehouse and Lovett explains it away as being from the cellars below the bakehouse. That may genuinely be the case. That may have been a cover-up. Every time I've seen that line delivered, it has been a slightly distracted manner, so it doesn't feel to me like something that Lovett was like making up on the spot and it was just a legitimate thing that was happening. But I also have an answer as to what that would be as well if it were made up, so hear me out. In regards to the chimney smell, they were turning people into pies. It's not like they were just burning people. However, logically, they were not putting all of the people into the pies, much like how when we cook with pork, we don't typically use the pig head unless we're making a specific dish, right? Like, it's hard to get the meat out, there's a lot of bones, etc. It's easier to just not work with it. So they had to do something with that, and they also had to do something with the rest of the bones, and probably the skin as well. And unlike butchers who were selling meat with the bones still in it and then selling the hides of the animals to other people, they had to cover the evidence, which they did with the furnace. And the smell of burning protein, such as bones, hair, and nails, smells really, 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 really bad. and like distinctly bad. So if a location smells really bad, but has never had that specific smell, and it suddenly adds that smell, people are going to notice, especially people who are super traumatized and therefore hyper aware of their surroundings and any changes within said surroundings as a survival mechanism, such as say the beggar woman who is the first whistleblower. Now in regards to the bakehouse smelling terrible, the first instinct is, oh, they have decomposing bodies lying around. But at the rate that people are buying Mrs. Lovett's pies and how insistent she is at Sweeney speeding up to get her more supplies because she is selling her pies too quickly, they don't have any pile up, so that's probably not it. Not to mention that Sweeney could not have killed more than maybe 2 people a day, otherwise it would start to get real obvious what they were up to. Unless you're in the original 732 pages, in which case nobody freaking cares. But at the speed at which they were going from somebody needing a shave to somebody becoming a pie was a very short time span, so there probably was not any rotting person smell if Lovett was organized enough. But based on the vibes of The Worst Pies in London, where she's literally killing bugs that are scuttling around her shop during the song, and in the 2023 version, she wipes her nose with her hand and then rubs it directly into the dough, Mrs. Lovett isn't necessarily the cleanest or most thorough in the world, so there's a very high chance that she left bones laying around by accident. Also, maybe they didn't burn the evidence and they just chucked it into the cellar. That's why it smells bad. Unclear. That could also be the answer. So if we're talking about that kind of smell, that would make sense. Also, the whole humans are just meat, so they wouldn't notice a difference in comparison to a butcher's. Butchers also smell bad either way, so the cellar being smelly and them commenting on that makes sense. But yeah, it's not a plot hole. It's the hair burning that would noticeably be different from the rest of the smells in the region, even if they were on the street next to like 15 different butchers. Though Fleet Street is and was most known for being the journalism print district, so it probably wasn't a lot of butchers in that area. I will also add, in the original text where they did not burn the evidence and instead left it in the crypt under the church, what was it specifically they found rotting there? Heads and bones and nothing else, which means my theory for how they were actually going about getting the meat to make the pies matches what the original authors thought of as the logistics. Anyway, thank you for indulging me on the side tangent. It has truly taken up way too much of my brain power throughout the research process for this video. Now, the other thing that is adjacently important for historical context is the fact that barbers also worked as surgeons because they were good with blades, doing dental extractions, bloodletting, minor surgeries, and occasionally amputations. When surgery was handed over to surgeons instead of barbers, barbers were very angry about it. It was a whole thing, but that's where we get tonsorial parlor and the tooth extraction scene from. The legal system at the time was a joke, with local men who were unpaid and had a very basic understanding of the law volunteering to be constables, making them inept, ineffective, and often abusing their power at the same time. In court, prisoners were not allowed to testify because they couldn't be trusted to uphold the oath, but they were expected to submit a written defense. At the time, 240 different offenses were punishable by death, often public hangings that tons of people went to like a spectacle because they thought putting people in jail would make them partner up with each other and wreak more havoc. In 1718, they started to deport criminals to Maryland and Virginia, and then in 1788, they started to deport them to New South Wales, Australia. The legal system was so ineffective, messy, and corrupt that it was common for victims to just pursue the perpetrators themselves and bring them to the authorities and turn them in. Authorities being beadles who were assistants to constables, and judges. So there you go. That is why they're going after it themselves and then bring it to the beadle. That's also why in the original, they are solving the entire mystery without getting anybody in charge involved until they bring in the magistrate. Now that brings us to the history of institutions. I made a 2-part series about the history of institutions a year or 2 ago, I believe. I will link it above and you should definitely check it out because there's going to be so much information in there that is not going to be in this video, aka I'm summarizing a specific era here and then I'm going to stop my summary at the late 1800s cutoff, and that video has everything else in it, including modern day, so please check it out. But when we think about institutions, we think like a madhouse, i.e. a place full of folks with mental disabilities, but this also included many physical disabilities. Workhouses or almshouses were generally just a hodgepodge of whoever could not be cared for by society, and madhouses were somewhat similar, albeit focusing more on housing disabled folks. However, it was common for men to put women in madhouses for things like having strong opinions, generally not conforming to societal norms. In Joanna's case, wanting to marry a man her own age instead of her adoptive father. The woman's property and assets would also be automatically transferred to the husband if they were admitted to an asylum, so there was some semblance of an incentive if the wife was wealthy. And much like today, once you were declared insane, it's almost impossible to prove that you are in remission or better or able to go back into society. I don't have a specific date, timeline for the UK. Researching for the initial video dates were all over the place and split between the UK and the US, and I never knew which was which. So the sketchiness of records still stands in this case. Lots of sketchy records when it comes to minority history, unsurprisingly, because nobody cares about us. It's great. Now, in early history, there were 3 options for mental health care, which former Sydney is going to tell you about. Option 1 was small subsections of hospitals, monasteries, or local community support specifically designed for the mentally ill relatives of very wealthy people. Option 2 was jail and or being being left to die. Usually being left to die was more for children than for older people, but it still happened. And option 3 was the precursor to asylums. These were places like workhouses or fools' towers where people were put and often displayed as freaks or used as general entertainment, but were otherwise pretty much kept in shackles because people believed that mental illness was the instigation of the devil and a moral and spiritual failing, and that treatment needed to be punishing that person for their behavior. One of the most famous of these places was the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem, which was founded in London in 1247. Its name is where we get the term Bedlam from, in reference to the amount of noise and chaos known to come out of the Bethlehem building. And I'm assuming that like accents made it get weird and then it just became Bedlam. I will also add that Bedlam was open to the public as a human zoo until 1770, and that in regards to incarceration, disabled people are disproportionately represented to this day in prisons. Not to mention that incarceration in and of itself is inherently disabling because it often causes many mental and physical issues. Institutional syndrome is a well-documented thing. But anyway, the idea of moral treatment, a supposed cure for mental ailments that involved treating patients with kindness and humanity and giving them the ability to work rather than using restraints and isolation with the goal of appealing to the parts of their brains that remained rational, appeared in the late 1700s. The idea that punishing mental illness out of people was the only option started to slightly dissipate in this era because King George III experienced significant mania to the point where they were trying to find a regent to take over for him, but he then went into complete remission, making people think that maybe mental illness could be cured, thus moral treatment. It was created by the French doctor Philippe Pinel and English Quaker William Tuke, and they proposed that it was enacted by no longer using restraints or using more humane restraints, though what is a humane restraint, or long periods of isolation, but instead placing them in specially constructed hospitals called asylums that provided lots of light and quiet and lots of nature and opportunities for meaningful work or creation, privileges and rewards for good behaviors, and that this would help patients to recover from their mental ailments. Pinel believed that mental ailments were caused by excessive exposure to social and psychological stresses, as well as heredity and physiological damage, which is kind of right on all fronts there. Like this era, you're gonna notice that all of this history is just a constant circle. This era is also when we see the creation of deliberate orphanages meant specifically for children. Moral treatment was very expensive to implement, and also people kept coming into the asylums and getting slightly better, but not better enough to be able to go back into society, or they would get, quote, better, be released, and end up back there a few months later, leading to lack of resources, lack of space, causing people working there to become burnt out, often leaving, which left these places run by corrupt people. Slight plot note for Sweeney, up until the 1850s in Europe, it was kind of required for the prevention of lice that anyone admitted to a prison, workhouse, or madhouse, or becoming a nun would have their hair removed and sold on the spot to wig makers. So Joanna sitting in a madhouse with a full head of luscious hair for several months, which that would not have realistically happened at all, which we can back up by the fact that in the original text, Mr. Fogg shaved Tobias's head the moment he got into the asylum. I will try to let it slide. Maybe Mr. Fogg was just really laid back at his job and forgot that he was supposed to do that or something, but yeah, this is the only actual plot hole that I found in the entire thing, so major props to that. Also, the beggar woman's physiological response to the arsenic would be the other plot hole. We'll get to that. Those are the only two that I found. But this is our disability history for the show. But it is not the only disability history that matters for the show because it was written during a very key point in disability history, which I didn't even think about until I read a 2016 Johns Hopkins University Press article titled, "Is That Just Disgusting? Mapping the Social Geographies of Filth and Madness in Sweeney Todd" by Alexei Grinenko. That was one of the most fascinating takes on the show that I have ever seen, and it made me make so many connections I would not have otherwise. So let's let former Sydney talk about the deinstitutionalization movement, and then we will tie that back into Sweeney. In the 1960s, we see a growing disability activist movement. There's also research coming out about those who had left institutions and how they had what was called institutional syndrome, which were deficits or disabilities in social and life skills that develop after someone has spent a long time in an institutional setting, including prisons, where they lose their ability to be independent or responsible, which is kind of like a version of learned helplessness, which made people want to clear institutions even further because we saw the negative effects that it was having on people who were in them. It was also clear that community and outpatient services were significantly cheaper, and even more exposés on the mistreatment in institutions kept coming to light. So in 1963, President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act to try to close as many of the asylums as possible, specifically saying,
"Under this legislation, custodial mental institutions will be replaced by therapeutic centers. It should be possible within a decade or two to reduce the number of patients in mental institutions by 50% or more."
There are also amendments and other laws put in place that shifted funding around in a way that incentivized states to deinstitutionalize. In the 1970s, there was a second wave of deinstitutionalization focused on freeing those with developmental disabilities, particularly after the 1972 documentary on Willowbrook, which is an institution on Staten Island, was put on primetime TV, and it showed people firsthand that the abuses that we heard about in the 1880s and in the 1910s and in the 1940s were still happening to this day, absolutely no different. There was also some big Supreme Court rulings, such as the 1973 one, that patients doing work in institutions were required to be paid minimum wage, that discouraged institutions from keeping beds full just to have free labor. A 1975 ruling that established the right of a patient to refuse treatment, and a 1978 ruling restricting states from confining anyone involuntarily for mental illness. That being said, this is when the satanic panic of, oh, won't you think of the children and whatnot started to set in, so we see the opposite effect of these things on children who are being increasingly sent to therapeutic boarding schools or boot camps and whatnot, which are just an off-branch of institutionalization. Next week's video on the troubled teen industry is going to talk about that, but a lot of these Supreme Court rulings allow the patient to have that autonomy if they're over the age of 18. And so all of these things are still legally happening to children today. Most institutions, as we traditionally think of them, were closed by the late 90s and the early 2000s. Many of them demolished, others used as museums, and some repurposed into office or residential buildings. While Kennedy did sign the act that there should be supports put in place for folks leaving institutions, he was assassinated shortly after signing that act, and the actual implementation of those things didn't really happen, meaning that there was not enough halfway houses and community care centers to support all of these people coming back into the community, leading to a large increase in houselessness. In New York City specifically, there was a well-documented surge in people deemed mentally ill on the streets. In 1980, the Department of Mental Health estimated a near total of 6,000 homeless deinstitutionalized on the streets of New York City, which led to lots of discussions about the mechanisms of institutionalization versus freedom with a total lack of support, and how both fail the people that they claim to care for. It also led to a large increase in media about madness in this era, along with many discussions about how oppressive systems are the things that cause much mental illness. Which, bringing it back to Sweeney, while they were writing the show and living in the city, they were walking down the street every single day and coming in contact with more mentally ill people than they'd probably ever seen before. Sondheim started writing Sweeney Todd in 1973, and the Willowbrook documentary was seen by most people at the time, or at least they all somewhat knew about it, especially since it was on Staten Island. So the fact that the descriptions of the madhouse in the script are weirdly spectacular is no accident. I can practically line up some of the stage directions to the moments of the documentary that they perfectly match. And in regards to the beggar woman, in this era, and honestly today as well, houselessness was very much associated with madness, and since the desire was to make the primary theme a focus on how capitalistic systems take in people and chew them up and spit out broken ones, that was literally a conversation and a connection already being had every single day in front of them on their television sets and on their streets. The story already had a madhouse in it, it already had a houseless woman in it, it already had two main characters who were definitely a little kooky, so it only makes sense to add in that extra context to make that point further. And from the text alone, you can tell how much care they put into this. Yes, the beggar woman is an object of pity and a bit saintly and whatnot, but she has way more depth than we often get today from disabled, especially mentally disabled representation. Her portrayals do not often have that, we'll get to that later, but the reason that this has aged so well in comparison to so many other depictions of madness is because they were clearly inspired by real folks when they did this. And it's weird because when I typically go this far back in disability representation, it's rarely even halfway decent, and I genuinely I don't think a lot of directors take its depth into account, but the original production and the text itself definitely did, and you can very much tell, which is just fascinating to me. There were just, I already talked about this earlier, but there's so many points in researching for this that I was like, we knew more about madness then than we think that we did, and we're kind of in the same place now than we were back then, and nothing's really changed. It's just super fascinating to me. Yeah, I read an article in researching for this by Heidi A. Temple titled Every Now and Then a Madman's Bound to Come Along, the use of disability metaphor in the musicals of Stephen Sondheim, Freak Shows and Freakish Love, which analyzed disability in Sondheim's Passion and Assassins, and how using those two shows as a center of the study, it appears that while Sondheim's work is rife with social commentary on issues of race, gender, economics, and relationships, he doesn't comment critically on disability. He simply relies on his disabled characters to provide metaphors that comment on other issues. As a result, the actual disabled people become tools for social or political agendas unrelated to disability oppression, specifically using madness as a tool to show the negative effects of certain things on people, specifically to show that things have consequences and outcomes, and feel a bit wishy-washy, unclear, unfocused, unsure of what it means to be saying or doing, which causes many situations where audiences feel unable to identify with the characters because they are made unlikable therefore, and it somewhat pushes stereotypes as well. Also, in some cases, such as Assassins, he directly uses and follows the freak show model. She then quoted a review of Assassins from the Washington Post that described it as a demonic grin into the void, a Sondheim specialty, as he proved in Sweeney Todd. Insanity can be comic. No, not the plight of the insane, but the delusions themselves. To journey into the psyches of the 9 successful and failed presidential assassins is to dive into a captivating pool of derangement, which I think reflects the use of the freak show model in that show, but I don't know how I feel about that concept when we bring it into the framing of Sweeney, because I think in general there is some ability to laugh at the comedy of disability in general, but only when done in an understanding in community way, if that makes sense. Like, using autism as an example, social mishaps are very funny, but it's different when somebody's laughing in an understanding way versus poking fun, freak show kind of way, if that makes sense. I'm overall torn about this concept, but it feels important to bring up. I feel like in Sweeney and what I know of Into the Woods, everybody is so over the top that it feels more like a different world with different standards and social norms than some sort of freak show that we're watching from a distance. But then at the same time, we demarcate difference of worlds and personhood by doing different physicalities and personalities and traits that are often direct mimicries of disabled folks, often accidentally, particularly with mental disability. So at what level would this make viewing any kind of show, like watching some sort of freak show that puts disability in caricature of disability, albeit typically accidentally, and where do we draw that line? And if having explicit disability or badness among that would then like point out the issues in general and actually make everything more ableist. I don't know. I don't know if that even made any sense. What I'm trying to say is, like, it's muddy and confusing because we can critique views of coded madness as being freak show-esque, but so much of theater canon reflects various views of madness because so much of the population, if not everyone, which I argue everyone is mad anyway, and where's the line between, okay, this is coded and this portrayal is an issue, to these are all just archetypes that historically reflect madness, but we don't really see it as that anymore, so does it have the same impact, if that makes sense? Like, traditional clown, for example, which we spoke about earlier, is based on mental disability, and we have a good deal of historical knowledge about that to prove that, but we don't really view it as being disability representation anymore. So is seeing a traditional clown show freak show-esque, or is it just a clown show? You know? Anyway, moving on from that rabbit hole, the other quote from her paper that I found interesting was her critique of how in Sondheim shows, the mental illness that is associated with these plots is either not discussed or simply waved off as madness. Because that's actually what I love so much about Sweeney Todd. I think the temptation, right, when we see disability in something is to diagnose and label it and be like, oh, this is a representation of this thing. I do that all the time, especially when I'm trying to prove a point that something is actually hidden disability. We're gonna somewhat do that later in this video, but from a historian angle, oh, she probably had PTSD and or autism, there's also an argument to be made about whether it's this disorder or that one, would not actually mean anything in the times and context in which that character lived. And if we're looking at disability and madness with the knowledge that it is socially constructed, looking at anything pre-1920s as simply within a vague category of madness is actually the most accurate and ethical thing that we could be doing. And it frames how it would be perceived within the narrative as it exists, i.e. how these characters would view each other, which at the end of the day tells us more about the nature of that character's lived experience than a specific diagnostic label ever would. Not to mention that most people who have DSM diagnoses have more than one, so having a historically mad character just play vague, historically accurate madness that is informed by lots of different versions of what general madness can look like and feel like, and can then work with that, makes it easier to construct a character rather than a caricature. And especially in this show, where the lines between mad and sane are wildly unclear, it further blurs those lines and it's fantastically messy, which is my kind of representation. It's the kind of art that I like to create. This is my thing. So seeing it done so well in a musical that's over twice my age is absolutely amazing to me. Maybe that's why I become fascinated with this thing. Anyway, I'm gonna cut off part 1 here and we will get back to part 2 shortly.